She's just a nurse. My mother-in-law humiliated me in front of the whole family, then a U.S. Army general walked in and saluted me. I've always believed that the loudest people in the room aren't always the strongest. Sometimes, the strongest person is the one quietly standing in the corner, carrying secrets so heavy that no one could ever imagine them. My mother-in-law thought she knew exactly who I was. To her, I was nothing more than an ordinary nurse in blue scrubs, a woman who had somehow convinced her son to marry beneath his social class. She laughed at my profession, dismissed my accomplishments, and never missed a chance to remind everyone that I would never belong in her wealthy family. But what she didn't know was that I had once commanded hundreds of military medical personnel on active battlefields. She believed she was humiliating a simple nurse. She had no idea she was insulting a retired Army commander. And the day she slapped my hand away in a hospital room, an entire military delegation walked through those doors and changed her life forever. My name is Sarah, and for most people who know me today, I'm just another ICU nurse at one of Boston's busiest hospitals. Every morning before sunrise, I pull my hair into a neat bun, slip into my navy blue scrubs, clip my hospital badge to my pocket, and head into another 12-hour shift. It's not glamorous work. Most days are exhausting. My feet ache before lunch, I barely remember to drink water, and there are nights when I don't sit down even once until my shift ends. But I wouldn't trade this job for anything. People often ask why nurses smile so much despite the pressure. The truth is, we don't smile because our jobs are easy. We smile because sometimes a patient who's terrified only needs one reassuring face to remind them they're not alone. I've learned that medicine isn't only about machines, medications, or complicated procedures. Sometimes healing begins with holding someone's hand while they're afraid. My coworkers always described me the same way. Sarah never loses her temper. Sarah always volunteers for overtime. If you're having a rough shift, go find Sarah. I appreciated their kindness, but none of them truly knew me. To them, I was simply the quiet nurse who never talked much about herself. While everyone else chatted about vacations, childhood stories, or weekend plans during lunch breaks, I usually listened more than I spoke. It wasn't because I disliked anyone. It was because I'd spent so many years living a completely different life that talking about it almost felt impossible. There are experiences that change you forever. Experiences that become too heavy to casually mention over coffee. How do you tell someone you've watched helicopters land under enemy fire? How do you explain that you've performed emergency surgery while explosions shook the ground beneath your feet? How do you casually mention that you once had hundreds of military doctors, nurses, and medics looking to you for orders during life and death missions? You don't. You simply smile, finish your lunch, and go back to work. That became my life after retirement. Very few people knew that before becoming an ICU nurse in Boston, I had spent more than 20 years serving in the United States Army Medical Corps. I wasn't just another military nurse. By the time I retired, I had earned the rank of commander and led one of the Army's most elite medical response units. Our mission wasn't to fight wars. Our mission was to make sure soldiers came home alive. Some of the injuries we treated still visit me in my dreams. Young men and women barely out of high school. Pilots pulled from burning aircraft. Special operations teams arriving by helicopter with only minutes left to save someone's life. Those memories never disappear. They simply become quieter. After retirement, I wanted peace. No more gunfire. No more emergency deployments. No more impossible decisions where choosing who received treatment first meant deciding who might survive. Boston gave me that peace. Working in civilian medicine reminded me why I joined healthcare in the first place. Here, families could actually visit their loved ones. Patients recovered in bright hospital rooms instead of dusty field tents. Children laughed in hallways instead of crying during evacuations. It felt like the life I'd always hoped to live. Then I met David. People always ask how we met, expecting some romantic story about love at first sight. The truth is much simpler. His grandfather had been admitted to our hospital after suffering a severe stroke. David barely left the hospital during those 2 difficult weeks. Every morning he'd arrive carrying fresh coffee for his grandfather's nurses. Every evening he'd stay long after visiting hours, reading books aloud because his grandfather could no longer speak. Most family members thanked us politely. David noticed us. He remembered our names. He asked whether we'd eaten. He thanked the cleaning staff just as sincerely as he thanked the physicians. That told me everything I needed to know about his character. One evening, after his grandfather had finally stabilized, David found me finishing paperwork near the nurse's station. "I'd been trying to think of a respectful way to ask this," he said nervously. "Would you maybe let me take you to dinner sometime?" I laughed. "You practiced that speech, didn't you?" "For 3 days," he admitted with an embarrassed smile. That honesty made me laugh even harder. So I said yes. Dinner turned into another dinner. Then weekend walks through Boston Common. Then holidays together. Then meeting each other's families. David never cared about titles. He never asked about my military decorations. In fact, when we first started dating, I didn't even tell him about my army career. I wanted someone to fall in love with Sarah. Not Commander Sarah. Months later, when I finally shared my past with him, he simply reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and smiled. "You saved lives before," he said softly. "You save lives now. I don't see any difference." That was the moment I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. We married a year later in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends. It was one of the happiest days of my life. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that happiness. David's mother, Eleanor, had made her opinion of me clear from the very beginning. She was elegant, wealthy, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed money determined a person's worth. She came from one of Boston's oldest business families and loved reminding people of it. The first time we met, she looked me up and down before asking a question that caught me completely off guard. "So, you're a nurse?" "Yes," I answered with a smile. She forced a polite smile of her own. "Oh. Just one word." But somehow that single word carried enough disappointment to fill the entire room. At first, I tried convincing myself I'd misunderstood. Maybe she was simply having a bad day. Maybe I was imagining things. I wasn't. As the months passed, her comments became harder to ignore. Whenever relatives gathered for dinner, she'd proudly introduce everyone else's careers. "My niece is a corporate attorney. My nephew owns 3 investment companies. My friend's daughter is one of the top cardiologists in Massachusetts." Then she'd glance toward me. "And Sarah, she's a nurse." She always emphasized the word just enough to make it sound smaller than everyone else's achievements. Most people probably didn't notice. I did. David certainly did. Every time it happened, he'd gently place his hand over mine beneath the dinner table. It was his silent way of saying, "I'm sorry." I'd squeeze his hand back to let him know it was okay. Because honestly, I wasn't protecting myself anymore. I was protecting him. I knew confronting Eleanor would only drive a wedge between a son and his mother. And David had already spent enough of his life trying to keep peace within his family. So I chose silence. Not because I was weak, but because sometimes strength means knowing exactly when not to fight. I had survived battlefields. I could survive awkward family dinners. At least, that's what I believed. I had no idea that one ordinary Tuesday afternoon was about to test that belief more than any battlefield ever had. Tuesday began like any other day, and if someone had told me that before sunset my entire life would change, I probably would have smiled politely and continued drinking my coffee. It was my scheduled day off, something that rarely happened. After weeks of 12-hour shifts, I had promised myself I would spend the day catching up on everything I'd been neglecting. My apartment needed cleaning. The laundry basket was overflowing. I had 3 books sitting on my bedside table that I'd been meaning to read for months. For once, I planned to do absolutely nothing related to medicine. David had already left early for work. "Promise me you'll actually rest today," he had said with a grin. "I'll try." "No, seriously, Sarah. No checking work emails. No answering calls from the hospital." I laughed. "You know me too well. I married an ICU nurse," he replied. "I know you'll volunteer to work even when you're supposed to be relaxing." "I'll behave." He narrowed his eyes playfully, watered the plants sitting by the kitchen window, folded laundry while soft jazz played quietly in the background. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. Years in the military had taught me that sometimes silence carries its own warning. You become so accustomed to chaos that complete calm almost feels unnatural. Around 1 o'clock that afternoon, my phone rang. David. The moment I saw his name, something inside me tightened. He never called during work unless it was important. I answered immediately. "Hey, what's wrong?" For a second, all I heard was heavy breathing. Then his voice came through, shaking. "Sarah." My heart sank. "What happened?" "It's Mom." Those 2 words were enough. "She collapsed during lunch." I stood up so quickly that my coffee mug tipped over onto the table. "What do you mean she collapsed?" "They think it's a heart attack." I closed my eyes. "Where is she?" "They're bringing her to Boston Memorial." "My hospital." "They're taking her to the VIP cardiac unit." "I'll be there." "You don't have to. I'm already leaving." Before he could say another word, I had grabbed my keys. Training takes over in moments like that. Panic doesn't help patients. Action does. Within 2 minutes I had changed clothes, tied my hair back, and was driving toward the hospital. Traffic felt impossibly slow. Every red light seemed to last forever. Despite everything Eleanor had said to me over the past year. Despite every insult. Every humiliating family dinner. Every sarcastic comment about my profession. I wasn't thinking about any of that. All I could think was one simple sentence. Please let her survive. People often assume nurses become emotionally detached. It's the opposite. We simply learn how to keep our emotions from interfering with our judgment. Inside, we're just as scared as everyone else. Sometimes more. Because we know exactly how quickly situations can turn from stable to critical. By the time I reached the hospital, the emergency department was operating at its usual controlled chaos. Stretchers rolled through the corridors. Monitors beeped continuously. Doctors exchanged rapid updates while nurses hurried between patient rooms. The familiar sounds immediately settled something inside me. This place had been my second home for years. Several coworkers spotted me as I hurried toward the elevators. "Sarah? I thought today was your day off." "It was," I answered without slowing down. My mother-in-law was admitted. Expressions instantly softened. "Oh no. Is she okay?" "I'm about to find out." Everyone stepped aside without another question. The elevator doors finally opened onto the VIP cardiac floor. Unlike the busy emergency department downstairs, this floor was quiet. Luxurious, almost. Private rooms. Soft lighting. Expensive artwork on the walls. It barely resembled a hospital. I found David standing outside room 412. The moment he saw me, relief washed across his face. Without saying a word, he wrapped both arms around me. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I felt him exhale. I was so scared. I rubbed his back gently. How is she? They stabilized her. That's good. They said we got her here in time. I silently thanked every first responder involved. Minutes matter during heart attacks. Sometimes seconds matter. David stepped back, exhaustion written across his face. I knew you'd come. Of course I came. I know how she treats you. I smiled faintly. She still needs someone to care for her. He looked down at the floor. I'm sorry. You have nothing to apologize for. No. I do. His voice cracked slightly. I keep hoping she'll change. I reached up and gently straightened his crooked tie. Right now your mother needs you. What about you? I'll worry about me later. He nodded. That had always been our relationship. Whenever life became difficult, we quietly carried each other's burdens. Before entering the room, David hesitated. I should warn you. What? The family's already here. I couldn't help smiling. When aren't they? He almost laughed. Almost. Then he opened the door. The atmosphere inside immediately felt heavy. Eleanor lay propped up against crisp white pillows, connected to several monitors. Her face looked pale, and for the first time since I'd known her, she actually appeared vulnerable. Seeing her that way tugged at something inside me. No matter how difficult our relationship had been, illness strips away pride. Or at least, it usually does. Surrounding her bed stood nearly every member of David's extended family. Expensive suits. Designer handbags. Perfect jewelry. Concerned expressions mixed with quiet whispers. The room fell silent the moment I walked in. Several relatives glanced toward me before politely looking away. Others didn't bother hiding their judgment. One cousin leaned toward another and whispered something that made both of them smirk. I pretended not to notice. David gently cleared his throat. Mom. Sarah's here. Eleanor slowly turned her head. For a brief moment, I hoped everything that had happened might have changed something. Maybe surviving a heart attack had reminded her how precious life really was. Maybe she'd simply be grateful to see family around her. Instead, the first emotion that crossed her face wasn't relief. It wasn't appreciation. It was disappointment. Her eyes settled on me for several long seconds before she spoke. I thought David called a cardiologist. The room became painfully quiet. David immediately stepped forward. Mom. What? She answered weakly. I assumed he'd bring someone important. I felt several relatives awkwardly shifting where they stood. No one said a word. I simply smiled. I'm glad you're awake. She looked away. I've been better. I imagine you have. A nurse entered the room carrying updated medication orders and smiled when she saw me. Oh, Sarah. Hi, Emily. I didn't know Mrs. Harrison was your family. I nodded. My mother-in-law. Emily looked relieved. Perfect. Maybe you can help explain the next stage of her recovery. Before I could answer, Eleanor interrupted. I don't need explanations from family. Emily blinked in confusion. I meant because Sarah's one of our best ICU nurses. Eleanor gave a dry little laugh. Exactly. The way she said that single word made everyone uncomfortable. I saw Emily glance toward me apologetically. I simply smiled to reassure her. It's okay. After Emily quietly left the room, I walked toward Eleanor's bedside. Years of habit took over automatically. I noticed the position of her foreline. the slight tension in her shoulders, the wrinkles in her blanket that could eventually become uncomfortable for someone recovering from cardiac stress. Small things. Things nurses notice without thinking. I leaned forward with a gentle smile. Let me check your blood pressure and make sure you're comfortable. I truly meant it. At that moment, I wasn't her daughter-in-law. I wasn't the woman she'd spent a year criticizing. I was simply a nurse looking after someone who needed care. I reached out slowly toward her arm, completely unaware that the next few seconds would become the moment everyone in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. My fingertips had barely brushed her arm when everything happened at once. Smack. The sound echoed far louder than it should have inside the quiet hospital room. Eleanor had slapped my hand away. Not hard enough to injure me. Just hard enough to humiliate me. My hand froze in midair before I slowly lowered it back to my side. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. The full pump hummed quietly. Outside the room, I could hear the distant squeak of a stretcher rolling down the hallway. Inside, absolute silence. David stared at his mother as though he couldn't believe what he'd just seen. Mom! His voice cracked with disbelief. What are you doing? Eleanor didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she looked at my hand as if touching her had been some kind of insult. Then she turned her attention toward David. Her expression hadn't softened at all. If anything, it had become colder. I told you this would happen. David frowned. What are you talking about? I told you before you married her. Her voice was weak from the heart attack, yet every word carried enough venom to silence the room. I told you to marry a doctor. No one breathed. Or a businesswoman. She slowly turned her head toward me. But instead, her eyes swept over my simple blouse, my inexpensive shoes, and the hospital ID badge I still hadn't removed from my pocket after rushing over. You married a nurse. She almost whispered the last word. As if it were something embarrassing. Something beneath her. Something unworthy. She laughed quietly. What could she possibly know about managing my treatment? Several relatives looked down at the floor. Others avoided making eye contact with me entirely. No one defended me. No one told Eleanor she'd gone too far. That hurt more than her words. Because silence often encourages cruelty. David finally found his voice. That's enough. His tone was firmer than I'd ever heard. You owe Sarah an apology. Eleanor looked genuinely confused. For what? For insulting my wife. I stated a fact. You humiliated her. I told the truth. David took another step toward the bed. No. His voice shook with anger. You insulted one of the kindest people I've ever known. The room felt smaller. Heavier. One of David's uncles quietly cleared his throat. Maybe everyone should calm down. Another aunt nodded quickly. Eleanor just had a heart attack. She's emotional. She doesn't mean it. I had heard those excuses before. Too many times. She's tired. She didn't mean it. That's just how she is. Don't take it personally. People become very creative when they're trying to excuse bad behavior. David wasn't listening anymore. You've treated Sarah like this since the day you met her. Eleanor folded her arms as much as the 4 lines allowed. Because she settled. David blinked. What? She settled. She looked directly at me. You're intelligent enough. I've heard you're hardworking. So why become a nurse? You could have been a physician. You could have run a company. You could have married into real success. Instead, she gave a dismissive shrug. You chose to spend your life changing bed sheets. The words landed like stones. Several family members winced. One cousin actually whispered, "Mom." But Eleanor wasn't finished. "Tell me honestly, Sarah." Her voice became almost mocking. "Doesn't it bother you? Washing patients. Cleaning wounds. Following doctors around. Taking orders from everyone else." She smiled. "I could never live that way." I looked at her quietly. For a long moment, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one. Because I had too many. If she only knew. If she had seen what I'd seen. She would understand that no battlefield had ever cared whether the medic treating you was rich or poor. No wounded soldier had ever asked whether the hand saving his life belonged to a nurse or a billionaire. Life has a strange way of exposing what truly matters. Money never stopped bleeding. Pride never restarted a heart. Status never saved a dying child. People did. People willing to serve. People willing to kneel beside strangers during the worst moments of their lives. That was what nursing meant to me. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I smiled. A calm, gentle, almost peaceful smile. David looked at me. "Sarah." I slowly reached over and touched his arm. Just once. Then I gave him the smallest shake of my head. "Not here. Not today." He understood immediately. His shoulders dropped. The anger remained in his eyes, but he stayed silent. I turned back toward Eleanor. "I'm sorry you feel that way." She looked almost disappointed by my response. As though she'd expected me to argue. To defend myself. To raise my voice. Instead, I bent down and quietly straightened the corner of her blanket. Old habits. Patients deserve comfort. Even difficult ones. Especially difficult ones. As I tucked the blanket around her shoulders, I spoke softly enough that only the people closest to the bed could hear. "I hope you recover quickly. Nothing more. Nothing less." Then I stepped back. One of David's cousins muttered under his breath. "I don't know how she stays so calm." Neither did David. Sometimes. Neither did I. The truth was, I wasn't calm because Eleanor's words didn't hurt. They did. Every insult leaves a mark. You simply become better at hiding where it landed. Military life teaches emotional discipline. There were moments overseas when panic would have cost lives. You learn to control your face. Control your breathing. Control your voice. Even when your heart is breaking. That training had never really left me. While everyone else watched the argument unfolding in front of them. My mind automatically noticed details. Eleanor's oxygen saturation. Her skin color. The slight tremor in her right hand. The rhythm on the cardiac monitor. It was instinct. The nurse inside me never stopped working. Even while being insulted. A strange feeling suddenly crept over me. Not fear. Recognition. A sound. Very faint. Almost too quiet to notice. Then I heard it again. Heavy footsteps. Not hurried. Not chaotic. Perfectly synchronized. My eyes shifted toward the hospital hallway. The footsteps grew louder. 1, 2, 3. Then many more. Every step landed with precise military rhythm. Thud. 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 The sound echoed through the polished corridor outside the VIP unit. Several relatives looked toward the closed hospital door. One frowned. "What's going on?" Another shrugged. "Maybe some kind of ceremony?" The footsteps didn't stop. They came closer. Louder. Steadier. Every instinct I had developed during 2 decades in uniform awakened instantly. I knew that sound. Combat boots. Not one pair. Many. Moving together. Disciplined. Organized. Purposeful. A nurse hurried past the room outside, looking unusually nervous. Behind her, another hospital employee quickly stepped aside into the hallway, almost as if making way for someone important. David noticed it too. That's strange. Nobody inside the room spoke anymore. The footsteps stopped. Right outside our door. For one long second. Silence. Then came 3 firm knocks. Before anyone could answer, the VIP room door slowly swung open. The moment the door opened, every conversation inside the room stopped. At first, all I could see were polished black combat boots crossing the threshold. Then came the deep olive green dress uniforms. Rows of colorful service ribbons. Perfectly pressed jackets. Silver insignias catching the bright hospital lights. The air inside the room changed instantly. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Every person standing in that doorway carried themselves with the unmistakable confidence that only decades of military service could produce. Leading them was a tall man with neatly trimmed gray hair and 4 gleaming stars on his shoulders. General Mark Henderson. Time had added a few lines to his face since I'd last seen him, but his posture remained exactly the same, straight as a flagpole, calm and commanding. Behind him stood nearly a dozen senior officers, military physicians, and decorated combat medics. Each one held the same disciplined expression. Each one stood perfectly still. General Henderson's eyes slowly scanned the room. For a brief second, they settled on Eleanor. Then David. Then the relatives gathered around the hospital bed. Finally, his gaze found me. The serious expression on his face disappeared. A warm smile spread across it instead. There you are. He took one step forward. At that exact same instant, every soldier behind him noticed me as well. What happened next unfolded so quickly that most people in the room didn't even have time to process it. Every officer stopped moving. Their heels struck the polished floor in perfect unison. Click. Then, as though controlled by one mind, every right hand rose sharply to every forehead. The movement was flawless. Years of discipline compressed into a single perfect motion. Their voices exploded together. Welcome back, Commander. The words thundered through the hospital room. Not shouted in anger. Shouted with absolute respect. The sound echoed into the hallway outside. Nurses passing by instinctively turned toward the room. Doctors stopped walking. Even patients' family members waiting outside looked over in confusion. Inside room 412. Time seemed to freeze. Eleanor stared at me. Then at the soldiers. Then back at me again. Her mouth slowly opened. No words came out. David blinked several times. I'm sorry. He looked at the officers. Commander? One of his cousins whispered under his breath. Did they say Commander? Another relative shook his head. That can't be right. Someone else quietly murmured. They must have the wrong room. I almost smiled. No. They were exactly where they intended to be. I instinctively straightened my posture. It happened without conscious thought. Years after retirement, muscle memory still lived inside me. My shoulders squared. My chin lifted slightly. My breathing slowed. For the first time in years. Commander Sarah quietly stepped back into the room. I returned the salute. Every movement crisp. Every angle precise. At ease. The soldiers lowered their hands together. General Henderson walked toward me until he stood only a few feet away. Then, in front of everyone watching, he extended his hand. It has been too long, Commander Sarah. I accepted the handshake. It's good to see you again, sir. The army has missed you. I've missed serving. He nodded knowingly. I had a feeling you would say that. Behind us, the silence had become almost unbearable. No one in David's family dared interrupt. No one even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on me. Her expression no longer held superiority. Only confusion. Disbelief. Almost fear. She looked at my simple clothes as if trying to reconcile them with the military delegation standing before me. It wasn't making sense to her. Just minutes earlier, she had called me just a nurse. Now one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army was shaking my hand with visible respect. General Henderson turned slightly toward the officers standing behind him. One of them stepped forward carrying a dark leather portfolio embossed with the seal of the Department of Defense. Another officer carefully held a polished presentation case. Even before it opened, I knew exactly what was inside. Military decorations. General Henderson accepted both items before facing me again. Commander Sarah Collins. His voice carried across the room with calm authority. By authority of the Secretary of the Army. Several relatives exchanged nervous glances. And on behalf of the United States government. The room became even quieter. I have been directed to personally deliver these orders. He opened the leather portfolio. Inside rested several official documents. Each bearing government seals. Each signed. Each unmistakably authentic. He handed them to me. I accepted them carefully. My eyes immediately recognized the format. Temporary active duty recall. Operational medical command. Classified overseas deployment. Exactly the kind of paperwork I had seen many times before retirement. General Henderson continued. A multinational humanitarian medical operation has entered a critical phase. His expression grew more serious. Our current leadership team has requested your immediate assistance. Behind him, another senior officer spoke for the first time. Commander, several nations are participating. We'll be establishing advanced trauma hospitals in an active conflict zone. Another added. Thousands of civilians require emergency surgical support. General Henderson looked directly into my eyes. Our unit is capable. He paused. But it is not complete. Then he spoke the sentence that left every person in that hospital room speechless. It has never truly been complete without you. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, memories rushed back all at once. The roar of evacuation helicopters. Dust-covering desert operating tents. Combat medics racing through explosions. Young soldiers gripping my hand before emergency surgery. The impossible decisions. The impossible victories. The impossible losses. I had left that world believing I would never wear the uniform again. Yet somehow, standing there in a quiet Boston hospital room, it suddenly felt as though I had never left. General Henderson smiled gently. We wouldn't ask. Unless it truly mattered. I looked down at the recall orders in my hands. Then slowly closed the folder. Finally, I smiled. How much time do I have? General Henderson's smile widened. I knew that would be your first question. A few officers quietly laughed. Your flight leaves tomorrow morning. David's eyes widened. So soon? General Henderson nodded respectfully toward him. I'm afraid the situation doesn't allow delays. I looked at David. There was surprise in his eyes. Concern. But something else too. Pride. The kind of pride that can't be hidden. Without saying a word. He smiled at me. Just the way he had the night I first told him about my military career. The same smile that had always said, "I believe in you." I turned back toward the general. Without hesitation. I came to full attention. Raised my right hand. And delivered one final, perfect salute. "It would be my honor to serve again, sir." The general held my salute for a long moment before returning it with the same precision that had defined every mission we had ever served together. "Welcome home, Commander." 4 simple words. Yet they carried the weight of an entire lifetime. As I lowered my hand, the officers standing behind General Henderson broke into quiet smiles. Some of them I recognized immediately. Colonel James Walker. The brilliant trauma surgeon who once performed 3 life-saving operations without electricity after our field hospital was damaged by enemy fire. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Alvarez. One of the toughest emergency physicians I'd ever worked beside, a woman who refused to leave wounded civilians behind even when our convoy came under attack. Major Ethan Brooks. The young combat medic I had promoted years earlier after watching him risk his own life to rescue 2 injured soldiers. Back then he had barely been 30. Now silver streaks had begun appearing in his hair. Time had changed all of us. Major Brooks stepped forward first. "It's good to see you again, ma'am." "You too, Ethan." He smiled. "I still tell new medics about Operation Iron Valley." I couldn't help laughing softly. "I hope you leave out the embarrassing parts." He grinned. "No, ma'am. I tell them all of it." General Henderson looked around the room. "I apologize for interrupting a family moment." His eyes briefly settled on Eleanor before returning to me. "But national security couldn't wait." "It's understood, sir." He nodded once. "We'll arrange transportation to the base this evening." "I'll be ready." I never doubted it. With that, he extended his hand one final time. We shook hands. Then he turned toward the doorway. The officers fell into formation behind him without a single command being spoken. Years of discipline made words unnecessary. As they reached the door, General Henderson paused. Without turning around, he said one last sentence. "The country is fortunate that you never forgot how to serve." Then they were gone. The synchronized sound of polished combat boots echoed down the hallway until it slowly faded into silence. For several long seconds, no one inside the room moved. No one seemed capable of speaking. The atmosphere that had filled the room only minutes earlier had completely disappeared. The confidence. The superiority. The quiet judgment. It was all gone. Even the machines seemed louder now. Beep. 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 David finally let out a slow breath. Then he looked at me. "Sarah." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You never told me." I smiled gently. "I told you enough." He laughed softly through watery eyes. "No. You told me you served. You never told me." He shook his head in disbelief. "That general's come looking for you." I couldn't help smiling. I didn't think it mattered. It matters now. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted us. A weak one. Quiet. Uncertain. "Sarah." For the first time since I had known Eleanor. There wasn't a trace of arrogance in her voice. I turned toward her bed. She looked completely different. Not because of the heart attack. Because something behind her eyes had changed. The woman who had always looked at me from above was now looking up at me. She swallowed slowly before speaking again. "Were." Her voice trembled. "Were all those men really there because of you?" I nodded once. "Yes." Another long silence followed. She looked down at her own hands. Hands that only minutes earlier had slapped mine away. The word seemed to catch in her throat. I didn't know. I know. She looked up again. No. You don't understand. Tears slowly filled her eyes. I thought. She gave a broken laugh. I thought I knew exactly who you were. I walked over to the bedside. Not as a commander. Not as the leader of an elite medical unit. Simply as Sarah. I gently adjusted the blanket around her shoulders again. This time. She didn't stop me. She didn't pull away. Instead, she watched every movement. Almost as though she finally understood what those hands had spent a lifetime doing. I judged you. She spoke slowly. Because of your job. I remained quiet. I believed. She closed her eyes briefly. That being wealthy meant being important. A tear rolled down her cheek. I thought nurses worked beneath everyone else. She looked directly at me. And today I discovered that some of the strongest people in the world wear scrubs instead of expensive suits. No one in the room interrupted her. Not a single relative. Perhaps they were all remembering every dinner conversation. Every sarcastic remark. Every time they had remained silent. Eleanor reached toward me. Very slowly. This time. It was her trembling hand reaching for mine. I took it without hesitation. Her fingers tightened around mine. I'm sorry. There was no excuse. No explanation. No attempt to justify her behavior. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. I smiled. Not because I had been waiting to hear them. Because I could see she truly meant them. It's all right. She shook her head. No. It isn't. I embarrassed you. I disrespected you. I looked down on you. She began crying openly now. And you still came here to take care of me. I gently squeezed her hand. That's what nurses do. She looked at me with confusion. Even after everything? I nodded. Especially after everything. She stared at me for several seconds. Then she whispered. I don't deserve that kindness. Maybe not. I smiled softly. But kindness isn't something people earn. It's something we choose. The room fell silent again. Not the uncomfortable silence from earlier. A peaceful one. The kind that follows truth. I pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down. For the first time. We weren't opponents. We were simply 2 women talking. Eleanor. She looked at me. When I became a nurse. I paused for a moment. I made a promise. To every patient? I nodded. To every life placed in my hands. I promised that their background would never determine the care I gave them. It wouldn't matter whether they were rich or poor. Young or old. Kind or difficult. My responsibility would always remain the same. I looked down at our joined hands. That promise didn't stop when I married your son. She quietly wiped away another tear. I understand now. I hope so. She took a slow breath. You know. When you first reached for me. I slapped your hand away. Her voice cracked. And a few minutes later. She looked down at my hand holding hers. It was the only hand I wanted holding mine. I smiled gently. Fear changes people. No. She shook her head. The truth changes people. The next morning, news spread through the hospital faster than I could have imagined. Apparently, dozens of staff members had witnessed the military delegation arriving. By lunchtime, everyone seemed to know that the quiet ICU nurse had once commanded one of the Army's elite medical units. My coworkers surrounded me before my shift. "Sarah, why didn't you ever tell us? Were those really generals? Is everything true?" I laughed. "It sounds much more dramatic than it really was." Emily folded her arms. "You call that not dramatic?" She smiled. "We've been working beside a commander this whole time." I shook my head. "You've been working beside a nurse. And that's still the title I'm proudest of." A week later, before leaving for my overseas assignment, I stopped by Eleanor's hospital room one last time. She had recovered remarkably well. As I walked in, she smiled. A genuine smile. Not the polite one she used to force. The real one. She held out her hand. This time, I didn't hesitate to take it. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. The word surprised me. "You don't have to say that." "I know." She smiled. "But I want to." She looked at David. Then back at me. "I spent so much time telling people my daughter-in-law was just a nurse." She laughed softly through embarrassed tears. "I'll never say those words again." I squeezed her hand. "Good. Because there has never been such a thing." I paused. "As just a nurse." Months later, after returning home safely from the humanitarian mission, David and I attended one of Eleanor's charity events. Several guests gathered around her, asking about her recovery. One woman smiled politely. "I heard your daughter-in-law works at Boston Memorial." Eleanor's face lit up with pride. "My daughter-in-law?" She smiled wider than I had ever seen. "She isn't just an ICU nurse. She's a retired Army commander who spent decades saving lives before she ever walked into that hospital." She looked across the room at me. Our eyes met. She smiled. And I smiled back. Because titles eventually fade. Medals collect dust. Uniforms are folded away. But the privilege of serving others, whether on a battlefield or beside a quiet hospital bed, is an honor that lasts a lifetime. If this story reminds you that no honest profession is ever small, and that true character is measured by service rather than status, share it with someone who needs that reminder today.